Before we get started with the show, we wanted to draw your attention to our crowdfunding page on Patreon. If you've been enjoying Always Take Notes, please do consider supporting us there. It helps us keep the podcast going.
If you support us on Patreon, you can get a great selection of rewards as well as a shout out on the show. Thanks to our latest donor, Anton Fries.
Anton left the Navy last year and is now Assistant Professor and Chief of the Division of Plastic Surgery at the University of Texas in San Antonio. So a slightly different background to some of our recent Patreons. He said, he moved here for the weather. I love the podcast and have taken a few tips for writing academic papers, especially drafting and editing. He also enjoyed the recent guest from Wired and FHM. Some of the 1990s cultural references really hit home, but definitely not the loaded generation. Thank you very much, Anton.
We've recently launched a new tier for our most generous supporters. If you pledge $20 a month, you get a free 2-month trial to Otter, worth $26. Otter offers automated transcription and live note-taking for in-person and virtual meetings. I found it to be a huge help with transcribing interviews for pieces. You also get access to a series of mini episodes from previous guests on the show, in which they answer 3 revealing questions. The latest episode features Phoebe Hurst and editor advice. Here's a snippet.
I know that when I was starting out, I spent a lot of time, writing pitches, applying for jobs, updating my website, researching for stories. And all of that's really important to be a journalist and really part of your job. But just as important is making sure you've got enough input and enough inspiration in the things that you're reading. So I found that as soon as I kind of got...
Hello and welcome to Always Take Notes. In this episode, we speak to historian and novelist Simon Sebag Montefiore.
We spoke to Sebag, as he asked us to call him, about interviewing Margaret Thatcher as a schoolboy, about his adventures in the Russian archives, and about combining writing history and writing novels.
It's another episode recorded remotely, so please forgive us for some audio hiccups, but it's a great episode. We hope you enjoy it.
Sebag, it's great to have you on Always Take Notes. Thanks so much for finding time. I wanted to start with your interview with Margaret Thatcher in your school magazine in 1983. A fascinating read. I was wondering if you'd tell us a bit about how that came about and what that experience was. So it's like a year post-Falklands, sort of Thatcher and High period. What was the whole process behind that one?
First of all, it's great to be talking to you. Thanks for having me on this. We've been meaning to do this for a long time, so it's great to finally do it. The Thatcher interview was really fascinating. I mean, even for a schoolboy, but of course, in retrospect, that since she's such a sort of great figure in British politics, it's fascinating looking back at it now. I think I was 17 or 18, and there was me and another boy at my school, Harrow School, we suddenly had this great idea that we should write to the Prime Minister and ask her for an interview. And of course, the chances were that we would never get that interview, but we wrote to her, and we were amazed to get a letter back from her saying, "I'm giving you an interview." And of course, there were connections to Harrow School. Her son had been at Harrow School and so on. But nonetheless, it was quite an extraordinary moment. And so, we bought suits and went off to Downing Street. And, it was at High, as you said, at High Thatcher. And of course, we were very excited. And it was just a sort of gripping moment. It was right after the Falklands War. It was the beginning of all the, it was in the middle of all the sort of struggles against unions of various sorts and the coal miners and what have you. And, we went into Downing Street and we were fascinated, but I came at it from a sort of slightly puerile direction, which was that at the time I was I think I regarded myself as a sort of Trotskyite Maoist. So obviously I wanted to be as kind of provocative as possible when I spoke to her, and regarded her as a sort of as the enemy. But in fact, she was incredibly nice to us and fascinating about everything, and fascinating about power. And a lot of what she said, resounds through the ages, really. So it was an amazing experience.
I quite liked in your sort of write-up of it in the magazine afterwards, saying that she exploited any flaws in your questions, anything where she could sort of turn it back on you as interviewers, she did. Was it a sort of an early exercise in how to craft to the point, direct questions?
Yeah, I mean, she was, she was astonishingly impressive. I mean, even a sort of teenager could see that she was extraordinary. And I've met all the prime ministers since, I think, and no one really comes close to her in terms of sort of totally penetrating intellect. I mean, she was incredibly sharp, incredibly powerful. She was kind of tiny with that kind of huge huge hairdo. And I remember when we first saw her kind of walking in the distance, we were both kind of just intoxicated by the sight of that sort of huge hairdo coming towards you. But she was herself tiny, and she was extremely kind of indulgent to us, however cheeky we were to her. She slightly twinkled, but she took our questions with absolute seriousness, which of course, we were delighted about. She talked to us as if she was talking to the editor of the Times.
What became of your co-interviewer?
He was called Scott Martin. I'm not sure. It's a very good question. I know he's out there somewhere, so if he listens to this, hello. But it was an amazing thing to have done. I remember at one point she suddenly got up and she came over to me, and I was kind of languishing in a very kind of slightly sort of loose manner, trying to show how unimpressed I was by Downing Street and prime ministers generally. And she sort of looked at me. She looked me up and down, and then she just said in that sort of amazing voice, she said, like, "Pull your socks up." And I sort of went, "What?" And she said, like, "I said, pull your socks up." And she was pointing at my socks, and they actually were kind of down around my ankles. And she said it again. And in the end, I sort of just like pulled up my socks and obeyed what she said. So there's a sort of, she was pretty terrifying actually to meet. But the funny thing was that afterwards she said to her private secretary, which was later when they opened up the archives, it was in some of the notes from their meetings that day. It said that schoolboy was extremely impertinent, and we're certainly not going to waste any time on giving schoolboys interviews ever again. But it was I mean, I must say she was, it was life-changing moment. I think it's good you chose to ask about this, because it was a life-changing moment, because it really made me decide that I wanted to write. And I was fascinated by history and fascinated by how power works. And she showed us around Downing Street. She actually, it was supposed to be about 15 minutes, but of course she took much longer. I think she quite enjoyed the whole thing. She showed us all the prime ministers that had been before. And of course, Churchill had been at Harrow, and she was fascinated by Churchill, as all prime ministers seem to be.
How did you prepare for that interview before we move on to your later, journalism and everything? But how did you prepare for that interview in particular?
I actually don't remember any preparation. I mean, obviously, we just decided to try and accuse her of all the sort of things that we thought were probably, had she launched the Falklands War as a sort of political measure to improve her popularity? Was she using extreme left-wing people in the Labour Party to discredit the opposition? So, the same questions that anyone would ask her today, probably, and they were pretty obvious questions. But that's what we asked her, all those questions. Why had she given a peerage to her deputy, to Willie Whitelaw, and hereditary peerages weren't hereditary peerages over? So we asked we asked her quite confrontational questions, and as I said, she answered them as if she was in the House of Commons virtually.
Could you tell us a bit about your kind of period at university, and then afterwards when you're doing banking and stuff like that, your route towards writing, as it were, through these other things that you did immediately after you left school?
Well, I mean, I went into banking. I mean, my family was a banking family, and in the 19th century and the first half of the 20th century, and I was interested in this, and also I was interested in the sort of the zeitgeist of the time, and I think that a lot of writers have never worked in an office and have no idea how life actually works. And sometimes, I think sort of journalists, writers have no clue about commerce, about corporations. So I always wanted to be a writer in the end, but I actually thought that it would be quite a good thing to know how sort of companies worked and how people went to work and offices and so on. And actually, I'm really pleased I did that, because it's really paid off in many ways in history. I mean, it's very good if you're writing about history to know how government works, how companies work. And so that's why one of the reasons I did it. And I wanted to make money if I could, which is always useful, right?
And how did you move into war reporting, and who were you writing for at the time?
My banking life was a bit of a disaster, but I was lucky that I made some money, so I could afford to go and start writing and write about exactly what I wanted. And I'd always been fascinated with Russia, and I'd always studied Russia in history and so on. So it just happened at that moment. I was living in New York, and the Soviet Union started to fall apart, and in 1990, 1991. And so it was just like a dream come true. I just went over to Russia. I rang up a bed and I didn't know where to go. I knew where I wanted to go. So I literally just organized, I looked up in the sort of yellow pages, a bed and breakfast company. And I just booked bed and breakfast to stay with Russian families or Georgian families or families in Uzbekistan, in Georgia, in Armenia, and in Moscow and St. Petersburg. And actually, it was the best thing I ever did in my whole life, because the Soviet Union was falling apart, and I literally witnessed an empire, the disintegration of an empire close up. And I knew families in all the big major cities. And the great thing was that I knew what was happening in Central Asia and the Caucasus as well. And not many even Russianists or experts were really in those places at all. And the moment I arrived anywhere, civil war broke out. And I was always there to go, and I sort of started to sort of report back from there to the English newspapers and the American newspapers. And it was an amazing adventure too, because I'd spent my whole life in sort of, boarding school and Cambridge, a bank, and suddenly I was just out in this country, in this crazy place where warlords had their own private armies, presidents were facing coups d'etats, all the foreign powers were fighting for control in these new small countries. It was just extraordinary, and it was what I'd read about all my life, and suddenly I was actually seeing it and witnessing it, and so it's really an experience that's paid off throughout my whole writing career.
I was wondering to what extent Lermontov was a kind of influence or a inspiration for that. I was seeing in one of the pieces on your website, you list him as one of your sort of lodestars. And I read Lermontov when I was 17 and thought it was like the most amazing thing ever. And did you have, when you were off to sort of buckle your swashes around the Caucasus, did you have particular literary touchstones in mind for that?
Yeah, lots of. I mean, I had all the sort of ones you'd expect. Lermontov, of course, but Pushkin especially, and Tolstoy, and Isaac Babel, and all the great Russian writers, but especially those who'd sort of traveled around the Caucasus. Yes, they were all part of it, and they were all kind of. Of course, I was kind of. Well, one couldn't help but think of when one was in Chechnya. One couldn't help think of Tolstoy's stories about that, or Lermontov or Pushkin. All of them were there. All of them wrote about it beautifully and in different ways. It's like at different times, of course. And yeah, so there was a great sort of, there was a great literary background to it, and also a historical background. Places like Georgia, Armenia, and later also the Baltics are all kind of forgotten. They were forgotten countries for 100 years, and more than 100 years. They'd been kind of forgotten countries because they'd been in the Russian Empire since the late 18th century, early 19th century. And then they'd had a few years of independence between the wars. Georgia and Armenia had only been independent for 3 years, in 1918 to 21. And then they'd been in the Soviet Union. So no one really knew anything about them. And that was also fascinating because, they'd kept all their culture all this time, and suddenly they were independent again, recognized internationally. And of course, they were struggling to cope. And they're extremely kind of beautiful countries, extremely colorful cultures, dense, deep cultures. And, in Georgia, I mean, I really love Georgia. I love the food. I love the singing. I love the people. And that's the country I got to know best out of all of them. But, yes, it was history. All my reading was sort of, came to fruition in these amazing adventures for about 5 or 6 years.
And I think I read an interview with you where you said it taught you how to write neat and quick copy. Is that right?
Yes, I mean, it's very good practice because, it taught you to write things very fast. I mean, I was a freelance writer, so I had to sort of earn a living as well. Although, I could go where I wanted, but I had to get the things published. And there were time stuff that was sort of suddenly the center of the world, the top thing on the BBC. I mean, it seems unbelievable these days because all you ever see is COVID or Donald Trump. But I remember once I was in Georgia, I was in Tbilisi, and there was a coup d'etat against the president, and I was with the president at his desk while he was under fire, and it was the lead story on the BBC News that day. There was an attempted coup in Tbilisi, and lots of people had hardly heard of Georgia, as I said. And I remember I said that this was a president called Gamsa Kurdia, who was a sort of slightly tormented character, who had gone from winning 90% of the vote. Within 6 months, he was facing a kind of multiple rebellions against him and a coup d'etat. And he was besieged in his own palace. So he'd gone from sort of hero to zero in a very short time. And I remember I said to him, "Can I call my mother? Because she's going to wonder where I am and there's a civil war breaking out." And and in those days, one of the few phones that worked was this kind of satellite phone that he had on his desk. So he said, you can call your mother. And he had all these kind of followers outside with guns and stuff waiting outside. And he went onto the balcony and started haranguing them in a slightly insane manner. And I sat at his desk and rang my mother on the satellite phone. And my mother said, she said, "Where are you? I hope you're not in Georgia. There's a civil war breaking out there." And I said, "Yeah, I'm at the president's desk. We're under fire. We're besieged." And then she said, she listened for a bit, and she said, "What's that terrible noise in the background? Sounds like Hitler speaking from a balcony." And I said, "It is. It's the president. He's addressing his followers from the balcony just outside his office." And she said, "Come back immediately," she said. Anyway, so at least she knew where I was. But these there were astonishing moments that were very good training for writing history. But yes, one had to write these things very quickly. And of course, in those days, you had to dictate everything on the phone as well a lot of the time.
That had actually been, my next question of how did you get your copy back? Because this is the early 90s, so unless you have the president's sat phone, communications are rusty.
It was kind of hilarious. I mean, you had to dictate it. And of course, no one had ever heard of these places or could spell them or anything. I remember one story I wrote about the Chechens. The sort of copy editors just came in and just changed every word, every Chechen to Czech. And just thought they were doing a marvelous job, a really helpful job, just correcting. Obviously they obviously thought that someone had just misspelled Czech all the way through, and so the whole story appeared as Czech all the way through in the news. I don't know which newspaper it was, the Telegraph or something, but it was just hilarious. So obviously I was at the time I was completely exasperated by that and infuriated, but it was just a time when you were just in a sort of new zone. And also, it was very fascinating because all these towns you were in, like Tbilisi or Baku, they were filled with spies. They were filled with quite adventurous people. They were filled with mercenaries, and they were filled with spies from Russia, from Iran, from Turkey, from America. All of them trying to influence these new little countries in a sort of new great game. So it was very exciting. I mean, I remember traveling with one of the warlords, and he had a whole lot of Mercedes. I don't know where he got them from, but he was traveling. We remember racing through the sort of Georgian mountains, and he just nodded to one of his kind of assistants. They were all kind of riding with machine guns on the outside of the cars, on the running boards of these sort of jeeps, and they all had Kalashnikovs. And I remember he just nodded at one of his guys, and he just put in a tape, and they had loudspeakers, and the tape was playing "Dark Side of the Moon" by Pink Floyd. And so as we kind of raced through with all these kind of people who've gone, they were playing Dark Side of the Moon, and sort of in sort of almost Apocalypse Now style. And I remember thinking, God, this sure beats working in a bank.
A message from our sponsor, Vitsu. Martyr's Story.
If only each shelf could talk, reflected Marta, a Vitsu customer since 2004. Her shelving system began modestly and has grown over the years. It travelled with her from London to Valencia and now Amsterdam. This is the 5th time Marta has bought from Vitsu. Every time, she speaks with her personal Vitsu planner, Robin, who reorganised her bookshelves to fit her Spanish walls and her Dutch house. He even sent her extra packaging to protect her shelves with each move. You might say that their relationship has become a friendship over the years. Marta knows she is valued and trusts the advice Robin gives.
If your shelves could talk, what would they say? Vitsu's 606 Universal Shelving System is a modular, adaptable kit of parts. It can form the perfect home for your books and even the desk from which to write one. Visit vitsu.com, vitsoe.com, or request a free brochure via email at vitsu.com by quoting ATN 606.
Vitsu, makers of long-living furniture by Dieter Rams.
How do you negotiate access to a warlord, if I may ask?
Well, you just turn up. I mean, you just turn up, and actually, one of the things was that one of the things that there were. I did meet other sort of journalists from the Times and Reuters and so on these trips sometimes, but at other times there was nobody there. There was no one else there because they were all really based in Moscow. And all the diplomats were based in Moscow. And of course, there were no embassies in any of these places yet. So a lot of the time, I was the only, sometimes I was the only, like when I was with President Gamsakhurdia in Georgia, I was the only person there at that moment because probably something much more important was happening in Moscow. And all the sort of real journalists were in Moscow. But it also meant that some very interesting things happened. Like when I went back to Moscow, I remember the American embassy and the British embassy, the sort of slightly spook kind of characters asked me to go into the embassies and debrief them about what I'd seen. And since a lot of these warlords and these militias were occupying former nuclear bases, Soviet nuclear bases, these American and British characters in the embassy, they wanted to know, of course, if there were if I'd seen any evidence of nuclear weapons. So it was actually sort of, I was thinking to myself, this is also just preposterously somewhat farcical that these people are asking me if I've seen any nuclear weapons. But they very solemnly debriefed me about these things, and I had seen missiles, but I hadn't seen nuclear. I didn't know if they were nuclear weapons. I hadn't seen nuclear weapons. But the point was that no one knew anything that was happening down there, and that was part of the excitement.
How did then the decision to move to writing books, and particularly with Catherine and Potemkin, take place? We really like on the show for people to lift the lid on the process and how it worked with the agent and the proposal and then the real mechanics of writing it. So yeah, from this peripatetic kind of quite adventurous life in Russia and the ex-Soviet republics, how did the move to book writing take place?
I'll tell you what happened. The civil wars of the ex-Soviet Union ended in about 1996, and all the sort of war correspondents went off to Sierra Leone and West Africa and Liberia and all that, and I just sort of I wasn't interested in West Africa. Actually, I wish I'd gone now because I already am interested in West Africa now. But at that moment, I'd also felt I really felt I'd risked my life enough. I felt I'd used up some of my lives out there. I mean, I'd really had some near misses, and not because I was being particularly brave or important or anything, just because, when people are killed in these places, they're usually killed by accident, by people who don't even know who they are. And I'd had a few of those situations where I just thought, like, God, I'm just glad I've survived this, I've done it, and I'm going to write the history. And so I'd always been fascinated since I'd done Enlightened Despotism at Cambridge about Catherine the Great. And when I read about Catherine the Great, I realized there were so many books about Catherine the Great, but that her relationship with Prince Potemkin, however you want to pronounce it, had never really been written about seriously. And when I started to read into it, I realized that he was a massive statesman who had never really been covered, and that together they were this very unusual partnership, a male and female partnership that was equal in a way that was very unusual. Could only happen because she was the actual reigning autocrat. It also involved love and sex, but it also involved power. So for me, I thought it was just like a perfect story that had never been told properly. And when I look back at many of the Catherine the Great books, and this always helps when you're choosing a subject, because when I look back, even really sort of admired biographies of Catherine the Great, often by famous French historians, had literally just repeated stories, without ever checking them from book to book to book. And so I suddenly realized I could go to the archives and I could probably find new stuff that no one had looked at. And so I wrote a proposal. I found an agent. I wrote a proposal, and my agent sold it. And so I just went off to Russia and started to research it, which was the joy, because I went into the archives in Russia, and no one had looked at these Potemkin archives for about 70 or 80 years, because Potemkin and Catherine the Great had been very out of fashion in the Soviet period, and so no one had really worked on them much. And so that was it. I was off.
And the Russian archives were just starting to open up a bit in the 1990s. How much time did you spend in them, actually, sort of in the archive?
A lot of time, and they are a kind of special experience, because it's not like working in the British Library. It's really a special culture. The Soviet Russian archives are a special culture. I mean, for a start, all the archivists have they're sort of hereditary. They're a sort of hereditary subterranean elite. Because most of the archives, a lot of the archives are stored underground because of in nuclear shelters, so they bring them up. But also they all marry each other because they all kind of because they all grow up together, and it's a great job to have. It was a great job to have in the Soviet Union. It was out of trouble, and yet it was kind of quite privileged. So it was a very good job to have. So if you got it, you also got your children jobs in the same archive, if you could, or one of the other archives. And so everybody knew each other, and they all married each other. It was a bit like a sort of village, and I really found it fascinating. And also there was a sort of there was a canteen there where you were able to get incredibly cheap food, very good food, sort of borscht soup or something, but literally for the cost of about 10 US cents or something ridiculous, literally ridiculous. And many of the people working in there were old Communist Party members who were sort of, as a hobby, working on some part or other of Russian history, or eccentrics. In the Soviet Union, there was a sort of way to survive, which was to sort of lower yourself, make yourself almost sort of invisible. But one way you could do that was by privately studying history in these archives, probably never to publish stuff. So these were probably very interesting people. I talked to many, some really interesting people who'd survived decades like this. And this was their hobby, their whole retirement they'd survived. And so it was an amazing adventure. And then, of course, the material was just so good, and out of it, I found lots of new letters between Catherine and Potemkin that no one had sort of identified before. I found all sorts of sort of amazing stuff about his love life and her love life and his bills, and I really tried to understand how her court, her personal life, her intimate life, her love life worked, and how the power worked. I mean, the way you really understand this stuff is by not just reading about Catherine the Great letters, but the people who she writes to and who they write to. And so I began to understand the circle, the elite circle of the tiny group of people that included her lovers and her top ministers. And that was just fascinating. That's the art of writing these books, actually, and researching these books, is to get into that, is to penetrate that world and understand which way power flows, and trust.
We had Anthony Beaver on the show a while ago, and he had a similar set of war stories about the Russian archives in the 90s. But a point he made as well was it was a narrow window. They shut after, certainly the Second World War one shut. Was that the case for the stuff you work on as well, that's not feasible now to get that kind of access?
Actually, that obviously the World War II ones, they're much touchier on. In fact, that's the one thing they were really touchy about, obviously. So Anthony suffered from that, but he got in there in a window. I was really lucky because first of all, the Romanov archives, the Catherine the Great archives, have no political importance now. So actually no one cared what I did with them. But I was extremely lucky because the Catherine the Great archives, the book I wrote, Catherine and Potemkin, allowed me, it was just the moment, it was just about 1999, and it was just the time that Putin was coming to power. And they were really kind of interested about recasting Russian history. And we all hoped that it would be a kind of new liberal kind of government, a new liberal outlook. And so my Russian publisher, weirdly, and this obviously this sort of thing only happens in Russia or countries like it. My Russian publisher was also the deputy minister of culture. And so he took the book to Putin. I was going to say to Potemkin. And I don't know if Putin read it. I'm not sure he reads very much, but if he does read anything, it would only be about potentates, like, you know, emperors and leaders and prime ministers. And so he, for some reason, he just said like this, you know, this guy has like, or people around him said, this guy has treated these Russian characters not in a way we'd expect of a sort of decadent Westerner to mock Russia. You know, I hadn't really written the book about she was an nymphomaniac, he was a preposterous clown. No, I'd sort of rehabilitated both characters as serious, great statesmen, as they should be, by the way. And so, so he said, like, we're going to open the Stalin archives, and he should let him look at the arts, you know, let him look at the Stalin archives first. And in this, I really was lucky because that was the big one. And everyone's fascinated in the Stalin archives. And Radzinsky, a sort of eccentric Russian playwright and sort of semi-historian, a slightly romantic writer who slightly kind of let the subjects fly away with him. He had a little look at the Stalin archives, but no one else had really looked at them. And so, and I had already dreamt of writing a history of Stalin, a biography of Stalin. And so this was just like my dream come true. So I went into the Stalin archives, and the Communist Party archives were much more luxurious by Soviet standards. And I mean, in the Catherine the Great and Potemkin archive, I mean, literally, I fell through the steps on the way up to the archives one time. You know, they were kind of crazy. And, you know, when I started working in the archives, the archivist dropped a kitten on my head on the day I started from the sort of gallery. And it was all in the next Romanov Palace, too. So it was that was an extraordinary place. But the party archives were much more central, and they were much more, you know, they were much more recent. They were a specially built building, and they had all the party secrets. And so, because I had this kind of gift from the government, from the presidential apparatus, from the Kremlin itself, I had my own special room, and the archivist brought me materials and actually, you know, really wanted to help me, and they'd been told to back me. So every day they brought me heaps of amazing new archives, and they knew whose handwriting was whose. So I could ask them, was this Molotov? I mean, I got to know Stalin's, but, you know, is this Molotov? Is this Beria? You know, so that was an amazing time. And I mean, every day I was just completely thrilled by, you know, I spent all day, every day there for many months.
And you learned Russian, didn't you, before you went? How long did that take?
Well, my Russian was never perfect, and it certainly is not perfect now. I had Russian lessons for years, actually. And I never became completely fluent at talking it, and I'm very shy about talking it at all now. But I could read, simple documents, and of course, typed documents of the Central Committee, in which many of these things were actually written in very simple Russian. They were very long, kind of communist jargon as well. But I could read those, but I couldn't read the handwritten Russian documents, which are illegible. I could barely read the French or English written documents. Some of the Catherine and Potemkin letters are in French. Some of them are in Russian, but I could barely read those. But anyway, the point was that they helped me with the handwritten Russian ones, the notes, and the other ones I could sort of do myself with the dictionary. So yeah, so I never completed my mastery of Russian, but yeah, I learned it for a long time, and just looking at these things, looking at Stalin's own, you know, writing was quite something.
Was there any complexity that came from the fact that your archival access had been kind of signed off by the current regime? Did they put any pressure on you to write in a certain direction, or did you feel there was any? What were they hoping to get out of this, do you think?
There was no pressure at all, and they brought me everything I wanted, and they didn't try and hide anything. And I think they were delighted to have somebody in those, because I was one of the sort of first Westerners to be in these archives. I think I had a sort of, and also, of course, I took them presents. They didn't want money, by the way, which was interesting, but I brought them things like, I remember bringing them huge, at the airport, I'd buy them huge Chanel No. 5 bottles, as big as this computer screen, you know, that size, which of course they were delighted about. But when I published the book, they were infuriated by it, and the whole kind of political direction had changed. By then, Putin had emerged as a sort of strong man, an autocratic character leaning towards authoritarianism, leaning towards sort of, orthodoxy, autocracy, nationalism, strong Kremlin. And when the book was published, it got exactly the opposite result, the opposite effect as the Catherine of Potemkin, which had got sort of great favor. I literally felt the icy wind of the Kremlin blowing from Siberia, having known the warm, radiant gaze of of Kremlin favor. And so I sort of suddenly I was basically sort of almost banned from those archives, a bit like Anthony Beevor has described when he talked about the World War II. And suddenly, like, I'd criticized Stalin, I'd revealed. I mean, I wrote about Stalin. The whole point about the Stalin called the Red Tsar book is I wanted to write. Stalin had always been written about before then as a sort of ideological Marxist sort of character, or as an inhuman kind of monster. And I wanted to treat him as you would treat the court of Genghis Khan or the court of Louis XIV, or the court of Henry VIII. Actually, it's probably a better English parallel. And so I wanted to do the personal history, the intimate history, and how power worked among the ruling group, which was normally about 6 people. And they socialized only with that 6 and only with their wives and children. So it was a tiny elite. And so the book I wrote was that it had power, it had politics, it had war, it had sex, it had killing, a lot of killing, because that was the way that they ruled at that time. And of course, they hated this. And they said, my kind of patrons there said, you presented him as a sort of gangster boss, and we hate that. He was one of the great rulers of Russia, and you've taken our archives and used them like that. Of course, this material was all in the archives, and so after that I wanted to write Young Stalin. I wrote them in the wrong order. I'd got all the documents I could from the Marxism Leninism Institute. That's this archive. I'd got all those documents I needed. There were always a few more you could find, but basically they kind of banned me. And when I went to try and get my room back, and I went into the archive, they all pretended they didn't know me, and they said, I said, "Hi, it's me," and they all said, like, "Well, we don't really know. We don't know you." I said, I was here for like 9-10 months, every day.
I read a story that one day you went and they said you can't access the archives because 2 of the guards have got drunk and fallen down an elevator shaft.
That's right. I mean, what happened was that they said to me one time I went in, they said, "Okay, you can come and work here, but you can't get any documents." And I said, "Why not?" And they said, "Yes, because 2 of the guards in the holidays got drunk and fell down the elevator shaft, and they're dead at the bottom." And I was like, and I just thought this was such a Russian excuse because, I mean, it was in Russia, everything is either conspiracy or accident. It was a sort of disastrous accident. And this was both. And I didn't know if it's true or not, but they said, like, we would bring you documents, but we can't because the bodies are in the elevator. I was like, are they big? I just couldn't believe. And they said this in absolutely deadpan, but they said and it was very Russian because they said, like, you do have permission, you have technical permission to work here. We wouldn't ban you, but you can't get any documents. You can sit in the reading room. So and that's where Georgia came in, which we were talking about in the first place, because I went down to Georgia and I knew I was very lucky in Georgia because I'd known all the first 3 presidents and quite well. And I'd known Shevardnadze, who was the 2nd president. And then I knew Saakashvili, who was the 3rd president. And I asked him if I could work on the archives, because when I went to Tbilisi, the Communist Party archives there were all closed. And he gave me permission. He gave me permission to get into these archives. And these archives in Georgia were just a gold mine, and no one had worked on them ever. They were fascinating, and that enabled me to write the book Young Stalin.
And when that came out and it had this, a lot of coverage and so forth, your profile rose a lot. What was it like riding that wave, as it were? The reception that those books got and so forth.
Yeah, I mean, the Stalin books really sold all over the world and everything, and it is an amazing kind of dream come true when that happens. And I do think also, I mean, obviously because I wrote them, I think they're very good books, but but one has to realize that a lot of very good books and a lot of very good historians and novelists and so on, this never happens to. And there's a lot of luck in it. And as we all know, if we talk about the literary world, we all know that every now and then, not every now and then, every bestseller list, you look at it, and there's somebody on there who's just got incredibly lucky and actually written a book that, you know, it may be the only one that is an enormous bestseller, or they've become a huge star because of timing in some way or other. So sometimes they deserve it and sometimes they don't. Oftentimes they do, oftentimes they don't. So I just think I was very aware of that, and I was very grateful that it had happened to me. And which is why I always try to help other people if I can help with, you know, if I can help with, if it's good enough, giving a quote or helping them, you know, introduce them to agents or whatever, because I do think, I don't regard it as sort of, as a sort of guaranteed thing just because of quality. It has to be, you have to get lucky too in all media life, don't you? In all creative life, you have to get lucky. So I got very lucky with those books, and they were sold all over the world. And since then, it's been a sort of dream come true in terms of, you know, the books being read by more and more people in more and more countries and so on. And that's every writer's dream, right?
One thing that struck me while I was doing my research for this interview is how many people read the book before it's even, you know, a finished manuscript. Your acknowledgements are sort of hundreds of names of, you know, experts that you've sought out. How do you go about finding those people, and how long does it take to sort of incorporate their notes and their expertise?
Well, I think the key thing about whether you're writing fiction or non-fiction, this is true for both, is that I think sort of a bit of humility about your own expertise is essential. And the really good, when you look at the really good books, you always find out that there's always some sort of a sort of an array of geniuses behind a popular history writer. You know, name anyone you like. You always look. If you look, they've always had somebody. And so, going to sit at the feet of the real experts on a subject is always a pretty good idea. And so, I always have everything checked by the sort of the biggest expert I can persuade to read it. Oftentimes they're outraged with what you've done with material, by the way. You know, they can't believe you've popularized it so much as to, you know, but I always ask everybody. And of course, with a book like, with the Russian books, I was incredibly lucky because my first book, I had Isabel de Madriaga, who was who was actually the Catherine the Great of Russian historians. And she was in love with Prince Potemkin. And so she actually asked me to, when I went to visit his tomb in Kherson on the Black Sea, she actually asked me to put a bouquet of roses on his grave, which I did. But she corrected my book and she taught me how to write these books. She was so ruthless with the book. Things that she said were just so coruscating and just withering, but that's what you need. Because people do write very stupid things in books unless they realize, you know, and so I took her lessons, and I've never forgot. But asking the experts is key, and in fiction, it's exactly the same. You want someone to read it who really has a good sense of what's good and what isn't.
What is your method just for marshalling material? Do you mostly use electronic systems, or do you use big box files? Like, how do you keep a handle on this enormous amount of documentary material and so forth that you have?
I'm really old-fashioned, and I think the only way to really do it is box files with cards, because I'll tell you why that is, because it sounds ridiculous in the modern age, but because the whole art of my use of archives is multiple use. You could call it layering, but it's multiple use of documents. So I might read one document that is Stalin writing to his hairdresser, for example, and saying he wants a new hairdo. But at the end of the document, he might say, if you don't do my hair right, I'll cut your head off. He might say he wants to send his daughter there. He might say that he's going to bring Molotov with him. Well, all of those things would go in different. He might say he'll give the guy a new apartment and a Rolls Royce car as a reward for being a good hairdresser. All of those things would go in different sections of the book, and you have to multiply file them and multiply use them. But you know, some academic historians weirdly often tend to just use one document in one place and that's it. and I call that layering. So I will add in layers and layers of this kind of material, which creates a very, very sticky and thick picture of the life at that time.
And do you, as you're researching, do you write little bits of the book as you go along, or do you try to collect everything first and then sit down and then commit it to the page?
I do it in a very inefficient way, which is I start at the beginning, I redo all the research, and then I start at the beginning, and I literally just race through without even looking back or hesitating for 1 minute until I reach the end. Because I'm more of a racehorse than a cart horse. So I write the whole book, and then at the end I go back to the beginning and I read it through to myself with the pen. I print it out, and then it's a complete bloodbath basically, because it's a complete mess. But lots of people do it completely differently. My wife, Santa, for example, she's a novelist, and she writes her books immaculately. She goes through and smooths them out, and everything is perfect. So by the time she gets to the end, it could virtually be published. While mine would just be unintelligible to anybody until I've put all the changes back in again. But it does work very well because it means you can move massive bits around. You get a feel for the whole book as it's read, and it is a good way of doing it. But it's very laborious.
I was wondering where your kind of interest in writing fiction came, at what stage along your journey. And I was also particularly interested in reading some of the fiction writers you listed as references, particularly people like Cormac McCarthy, Larry McMurtry. These are writers I really love myself. But when, I suppose this idea we're talking about writing like Eastern Westerns and things, but more broadly, when did you decide you didn't just want to write history and you wanted to do fiction as well?
Funny enough, I always wrote fiction, and I wanted to write fiction first. And a lot of historians that's true of. I know Anthony Beevor, for example, wrote fiction first also. But writing fiction is really my first, and Tom Holland as well. A lot of good historians love writing fiction. I've been really lucky in that my fiction is sold all over the world, and is being developed into a drama series and all this kind of stuff. And actually, it's been really pretty fun, and I'm very proud of that, of the Moscow trilogy. I always wanted to write it, and I dreamed of writing when I was in the Caucasus. I remember just reading Isaac Babel, who's one of my great Russian literary heroes, thinking, God, I'd love to write stories about this period, about this time. And when I was researching in the Stalin archives, I found a picture of a girl who was really beautiful, and she was in her early 30s or maybe late 20s, and she was the mother of children, and she was arrested and executed days later with a shot to the back of the head, as you were executed in 1937, 38. And I thought to myself, that is the person I want to write a novel about. And so that's how Sashenka, the first of the Moscow trilogy, came about. And the story, I found the story in the archives, actually. So the stories in all three books of the Moscow trilogy, the stories are all true, essentially true. And in some cases, I've actually met people that these things happened to, exactly. And particularly the story of One Night in Winter, which is the middle book. But in answer to your question about the hero, the sort of literary inspiration. So a lot of it is inspired by Russian writers, but also, yes, Elmore Leonard, Larry McMurtry. The third book, Red Sky at Noon, is really a Western, is an adventure story, is a Western on the Eastern Front. And it was really inspired by those Elmore Leonard and Blood Meridian and those books, which I love. And I just thought it was an interesting idea. But much of the fighting at that time took place on horseback, on the steppes, and so it wasn't that dissimilar from those Westerns, from the time of those Westerns. And of course, it was absolutely brutal fighting, brutal time. The first two books are really about love. And they've really, all the leading characters are women, really. There's Sashenka, there's Dashka, there's Seraphima, there's Katinka. They're all the leading characters are women, and all the stories are real. And those books have been translated into many languages now. And it's actually, in lockdown, it's actually been extraordinary because so many people have everyone seems to be reading them. They've suddenly started selling again in an enormous way all over the place. So it's been very satisfactory.
Simon, it's a rule of the podcast that we ask everyone about money and how it interfaces with their writing lives. Now, be as frank or as guarded as you want, but how has it worked for you? So, I mean, and what fraction of your income now comes from the histories, say, as opposed to the fiction and the TV stuff? And to what extent did family money as well play in facilitating what you've been able to do?
I'll tell you what, actually, I came from a sort of banking family, but actually I wasn't really the recipient of a large inheritance at all. And so, which is why one of the reasons why I went into the city after Cambridge. And I was lucky in there because even there I had all sorts of ups and downs. I made a bit of money, which funded my about 10 years of adventures in the Soviet Union. And really writing what I wanted to write, which was the biggest blessing and the biggest gift I could have had. But at the end of it, there wasn't much left, and so I really do. I live on my writing essentially, and I have been incredibly lucky because I always wondered, would I ever be able to afford to live on just the writing? But I gave up journalism in 1999, I think, which is now 20 years ago. And so since then, it's all, I can't sort of break down the deals for you. But what's interesting is that obviously originally it was just England. And then with the Stalin books, it just expanded into all over the world. So I think there are now, I don't know how many deals there are. I don't know how many countries it's sold in, but a lot. And so of course, America's a big one. China is a very big one. I think Jerusalem has sold hundreds of thousands. I think it sold 600,000 or 700,000 copies in China, strangely, in Chinese. So anyway, so basically, to be as candid as I can, writing is basically, virtually all my income is from the books and the media, television, books, and fiction and non-fiction. So which is a lovely thing, actually.
And in terms of your books, your collections of letters and speeches and your children's books that you co-write with your wife, what made you want to do those? And was it because Jerusalem was such a sort of massive project and such a sort of slog that you felt like a different change of pace?
Yeah, I mean, that's a very good point. I mean, after these books are, the history books are incredibly labor intensive, incredibly stressful. I mean, I actually find them very difficult to do. And so I try not to do too many of them, and they're always very, very intense. And the only way to write any book successfully is to be obsessional and to be obsessed about it and to be immersed in it, fiction or non-fiction. But obviously, fiction is physically easier to write, and there's less of it, and you're marshalling less material. So yeah, after Jerusalem and the Romanovs, which were the last two big books, I thought it'd be really fun to do the Royal Rabbits of London books with Santa, which is also a nice thing to do with your wife anyway. And that was 4 books, and that actually has been a great joy to do, very happy experience. The letters and speeches are a different thing. I mean, I love to read very widely, and I've always been very interested in sort of world history. And so I'd sort of always found letters in all sorts of funny places that I thought, God, this should be in a letters collection, but it isn't. And so my publisher said to me, would you like to do a letters book? And I've loved doing an anthology. To anthologize is a very pleasurable thing to do, very civilized. And so I've done that. And then they said, would you do the voices, the speeches one? So those 2 books are fun. But also another reason I wanted to do them was, there's a certain sort of person that doesn't want to read a 900-page book on Jerusalem, but loves history and wants to read a book of great letters from all over the world, from all over history, that explains the letters in a simple way. And so I've loved doing that. And the books have been read by a completely different sort of person. There's a whole lot of people who would never read Romanovs or Stalin, but who love those books and are sort of interested in those books. And so I've loved doing that actually. So they've been a lot of fun to do. But that's enough anthologies now, I think.
We're coming up against our at the end of our time, but I wanted to ask as a sort of final thing about TV and your work. So kind of the two elements of this. So the documentary presenting, but also these adaptations and how they came about and what stage they're at, and then also what level of involvement you have with the screenwriters and things like that.
Well, the TV. What happened was that the BBC asked me to do a series on Jerusalem, and then they asked me to do another series on Rome. And then another one, and so then we did 5 altogether. So we did Rome, we did great cities. We did Jerusalem, Vienna, Rome, Madrid, Cordoba, Istanbul. I was very lucky. I did 5 series for BBC 4, which was, and I just love living in a beautiful city, particularly in a sort of grand hotel, for about sort of 2 months, and I love that thing when the doorman knows what sort of coffee you want to take or what cocktail you drink, and I just love hotels, and especially in lockdown, I've been sort of dreaming of hotels and bars and restaurants and great cities, Bosphorus, the Tiber. So anyway, yeah. Sorry, before I get carried away there, that's the reason. So that's been an immensely pleasurable thing, but they are really they really take a lot of time, TV documentaries, and there's a certain sort of BBC documentary, when they part of it is like, because there's you have experts talking on, and we had very distinguished people talking on our documentaries. We had other historians and so on, but also a lot of it is like, okay, Simon, will you walk just for sort of 10 minutes in that direction? We'll film you from afar, and then walk back, and we'll just use that. So that's very much the BBC method of documentary making. Anyway, so there are longueurs to it, but I love doing it, and actually I'd love to do another one now. I sort of, after a few years, I sort of actually miss it, but I got a little sick of it as well. The film and TV drama documentaries, I'm sorry, drama sort of, that is a fascinating thing, and those are options that are bought by people, and they just approach you, and sometimes they approach you in quite a surprising way. I mean, when Angelina Jolie bought the Catherine the Great and Potemkin rights, she didn't ring me and say it's Angelina Jolie. She just sort of offered for the rights from her production company, which is kind of extraordinary. So I remember when my agent rang up and said, this production company, they've sent an offer through, but we don't know who they are, and they won't say who they are. But it's a very good offer. So what should we do? And I just said, well, find out who are they. So then, then it turned out it was Angelina Jolie, for example. But the one thing you learned, one time or another, I've sold all the books, as they've all been optioned in one way or another. And the one thing you realize is that actually the challenge now is not to option them, but to get them optioned by people that are actually going to make them. So none have actually been made yet. I actually think this year, a couple of them will get made, so which will be very exciting. But it's some of them have been optioned on and off for decades, literally decades, for almost 2 decades. But and you get an income from that, and that's very useful as a writer. But of course, I'm just dying for one of them to be made now.
Because the real money comes from the first day of photography, right? It's not the option so much as the actual, getting on set.
Yeah, but it is very useful because I think at one point in the last few years, I've had about 10, and because I've also created some that I've sold, original scripts and stories and stuff, and I've sold them. But it is quite useful because if you have more than, and I think I had about quite a few deals, and so if you have them being renewed every year, it's pretty useful actually, for paying bills.
Well, look, Simon, that's a great and very pragmatic point on which to end. Thank you for being a fantastic guest on Always Take Notes. It's great to have got you on, and we wish you all the best with your multitude of projects going forward.
Thanks for having me. This has been a lot of fun.
Hello, it's us again. Simon, what was your highlight of the interview with Sebag?
I really enjoyed that interview, not least because I'd been trying to persuade him to come on the show for about 2 years, so it was a bit of a coup to get him on finally. It was excellent. I mean, he's one of these guys who is clearly very established in that writing kind of narrative history niche, but I was also particularly interested in the fact that he combined it with novel writing, because as we discussed in my episode, I'm interested in having another crack at trying to write fiction, and the fact that he saw the two not only as possible to combine, but potentially mutually complementary. I found that was really kind of heartening. What about you?
Yes, and I equally enjoyed listening to him talk about his early years as a sort of war correspondent and how that segued into his other writing. I am disappointed that we did not ask him about Get to the Spice Girls and how he discovered that they were all Eurosceptics. A majestic piece.
We effectively we buried the lead with that one. But
we did. I did promise him that I would bring it up, so listeners should go and Google that.
Perhaps we could commission a bespoke mini episode in which he talks about the Spice Girls as
I'm
a
pro
way to
that.
finally cover
Yeah.
this one. Anyway, Rachel, what have you been up to otherwise?
I have been putting together some pictures for profiles and covering for the print section this week, so it's been busy but good. How about you?
Can you disclose your profile subjects?
I can, because it's arranged, so it's not going to fall through. I'm interviewing a guy called Arthur Brand, who is called the Indiana Jones of the art world. He rediscovers stolen and lost artworks, often from the underworld and in plastic bags and things like that. So it should be jolly.
That sounds fascinating. I have been working on a proposal, this long-running thing that I've been working on for another book, which is a bit under wraps at the moment, but with luck, that will move forward. And I've also been doing the edit on a piece for Outside Magazine, and in a bit of self-aggrandizement, I was nominated for the Orwell Prize for some of my work for 1843, which was very gratifying. So all has been good at Always Take Notes Towers. This has been Always Take Notes, hosted by me, Simon Acombe.
And me, Rachel Lloyd.
Our producer and social media editor is Artemis Irvin. Our graphic design is by James Edgar, and our score is by Jess Danheiser.
If you'd like to follow us on social media, you can find us on Facebook and Instagram at Always Take Notes, on Twitter at Take Notes Always. Our crowdfunding page is on Patreon at Always Take Notes. And if you'd like to leave a review on iTunes or get in touch with us, please do.
Many thanks. Goodbye.